Hello and welcome to lecture number 12. This is the first lecture of Unit 2, African Explorers in the Americas. The first learning objective is to explain the significance of the roles Ladinos played as the first Africans to arrive in the territory that became the United States. Let's start with Ladinos. Ladinos were free and enslaved Africans who were familiar with Iberian culture in the early 16th century because they lived most or all of their lives in Europe. These were some of the first people taken from the West African coast and imported into Spain and Portugal as laborers. Some of them gained their freedom, and others continued to work as domestic servants or laborers in large cities like Lisbon or Seville. By virtue of living in the Iberian Peninsula, they spoke either Portuguese or Spanish and occupied positions such as domestic servants, merchants, and artisans. When the age of exploration started, they journeyed with Europeans in the earliest explorations of the Americas. The first documented arrival of Africans in the Americas was in 1502, and by 1510, the Spanish crown had authorized the direct shipment of enslaved Africans to the colonies. They were the first Africans in the territory that would later become the United States, and they were brought along because they were perceived to be safe companions to the Spanish and Portuguese and were useful as domestic servants. The picture on the screen is of one such Ladino, a painter by the name of Juan de Pareja. He was an acquaintance of the famous royal court painter Diego Velázquez, and this is a portrait by Velázquez. Ladinos were part of a generation known as the Atlantic Creoles. These were people who were intermediaries between Europeans and natives in the Americas before the predominance of chattel slavery. Some of the people who were part of this Creole culture were mulatto or mixed-race servants. They spoke Creole languages like Bozal Spanish, a language that is now extinct. These languages were often a mixture of Spanish, Portuguese, and African languages. In the New World, they maintained a measure of social mobility because of the familiarity with multiple languages, cultural norms, and commercial practices of the Europeans. Due to their efforts or contributions to the colonization process, they were also able to attain land or titles after helping Europeans subjugate the indigenous populations of the Americas. By the mid-16th century, Atlantic Creoles were present in nearly every Spanish and Portuguese colony, contributing to the early development of colonial societies. The Ladinos were essential to the efforts of European powers to lay claim to indigenous lands. They accompanied explorers like Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who discovered the Pacific Ocean in 1513. They were used by the Spanish explorers to invade the islands of Puerto Rico in 1508 and Cuba in 1511. Once the people were subjugated, Ladinos were essential to building the infrastructure of these new Spanish colonies. Because Spain was the first country exploring North America, the black Ladinos and Creoles they brought with them had a participatory role in colonizing North America. For example, Juan Garrido, a free African conquistador, was part of expeditions to Florida and Mexico. While the early black settlers and colonizers were free or had a degree of freedom, as time went on, the Spanish turned to enslaved people referred to as pozales, which is the Spanish word for muzzle. They used them for hard labor because the indigenous people the Spanish enslaved were quickly dying off due to contact with Europeans and the diseases they brought, like smallpox. Both free and enslaved Africans went with the Spanish across all the places they explored in North America, including La Florida, which encompasses modern-day Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia. The second learning objective is to describe the diverse roles Africans played during the colonization of the Americas in the 16th century. They occupied three different roles: conquistadors, free skilled workers, and enslaved laborers. The conquistadors were the military forces that subjugated the native populations and indigenous civilizations of the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru. Africans participated in these conquests because they often hoped to gain their freedom or later attain titles and land. One example is Juan Beltrán de Magaña in Chile. He was a black conquistador who helped subjugate the indigenous people in the southernmost part of the Spanish colonization of modern-day Chile. Another example is Sebastián Toral, who participated in the conquest of the Yucatan Peninsula and later became a landowner in Mexico. We've also already referenced the instances in which Ponce de León used enslaved Africans in Puerto Rico and Diego Velázquez Cuellar used them in Cuba. The other role Africans filled in the Americas was a free skilled worker or artisan. They were sometimes awarded encomiendas for their service in the military, and they used their new freedom and land that they were awarded to make a living for themselves in New Spain. Later in the 1700s in Spanish Florida, Fort Mose became the first free black community composed of escaped enslaved Africans and runaways from the British North American colonies. Fort Mose was established in 1738 and served as a northern defense post for St. Augustine, the capital of Spanish Florida. The last role they occupied was as enslaved laborers. The enslaved indigenous laborers often died too quickly after European contact, so the Spanish started to import enslaved Africans. They referred to them as bozales, used as early as 1518 in New Spain. And later, when the Portuguese colonized Brazil and used it for sugarcane plantations, they imported enslaved people in 1550. The image on the screen shows the city of Recife in Brazil with the new imported enslaved Africans. The bozales endured the most difficult and dangerous working conditions in New Spain. They worked in extracting silver and gold from the mines of Mexico and Peru. These were extremely dangerous because the mines could collapse at any time, and they were also subject to inhaling toxic dust, creating breathing problems. Most bozales were also used to harvest pearls off the coast of Veracruz in Mexico, and as mentioned before, worked on sugar plantations in Portuguese Brazil. Work on sugar plantations was the most arduous because sugarcane was usually grown in hot and humid environments, and the enslaved Africans worked every part of the sugar producing process, from planting and harvesting to refining the sugar to be sent back to Europe and Africa. One main example of a black African in New Spain was the conquistador Juan Garrido. He is said to have been born in the Kingdom of Congo, and he was a free man while he lived in Lisbon, adopting the name Handsome John. He later moved on to the city of Seville and eventually made it to North America. He is the first known black African to arrive in North America, exploring various regions, including present-day Florida, in a 1513 expedition. He eventually went down to Mesoamerica and became the personal attendant to Hernán Cortés, fighting in the siege of Tenochtitlan, which is modern-day Mexico City. In the codices or picture books that the Aztecs produced detailing the coming of the Spanish and the conquest of the city, Juan Garrido is portrayed in several panels. He is also credited with being the first person to plant wheat in Mexico. After the conquest, he attained freedom, a plot of land, and a few government positions. He was able to marry a Spanish woman, but the historical record shows that his life was less than stable by virtue of trying to petition the Spanish crown for back pay that he deserved through his military service. Another example is Esteban or Estebanico. He was an enslaved African healer from Morocco. He was brought by the Spanish in their expeditions and was part of the Narvaez expedition going through the Gulf Coast. The expedition suffered many setbacks and difficulties. Eventually, the expedition was shipwrecked near modern-day Galveston, and he and the surviving soldiers who washed ashore were enslaved by the indigenous tribes. It was the same group that had enslaved the famous Spanish explorer Cabeza de Vaca, and that's how we know about Estebanico's life experience. After several years of living with the indigenous tribe in the Gulf Coast, he managed to escape and marched through Texas and the modern southwestern United States before making it down to the New Spain city of Sinaloa. The information he brought back to the Spanish officials actually inspired the Spanish to send more expeditions into the American Southwest. Sadly, he was eventually killed by indigenous groups resisting Spanish colonialism. During his life, Estebanico's knowledge of indigenous languages and cultures made him a valuable guide and mediator during these expeditions. Finally, here's a recap. Latinos were black people who spent time in the Iberian Peninsula before coming in the first black people in the Americas. The Latinos were part of an Atlantic Creole culture through their interactions and blending of various cultures. The Latinos were essential to the efforts of European powers in laying claim to indigenous lands. Africans in the Americas were either conquistadors, enslaved laborers, or free-skilled workers and artisans. Juan Garrido, a black man born in the Congo, participated in the Spanish conquest of Florida, and Estebanico, who was forced to work as a translator in the expeditions but was ultimately killed by Native Americans. The contributions of these African explorers and settlers played a significant role in the early colonization and development of the Americas. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.